Paranormal, a word that usually invokes one of two reactions. The first being that of skepticism, a furrowed brow. The other being that of intrigue and an open mind. In this series, I will be exploring the unexplained and inexplicable events all around the United Kingdom, beginning with that of one of the most disturbing and harrowing cases in UFO folklore. Ladies and gents, I invite you to sit back, relax, turn out those lights, and dive in with me as we explore the Edinburgh A70 incident. Welcome to UnNerving UnKnowN. The following video contains elements some viewers may find distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Alien abduction. Since the first ever widely reported abduction event occurred in 1961, the Betty and Barney Hill case, this subject has been met with severe skepticism, dismissal, and even in the worst scenarios, mockery and hostility, due to the sheer incomprehensible and outright unsettling nature of this topic. Now, the term itself refers to the recovery of subjectively real memories under hypnosis of being taken against one's will by extraterrestrial entities aboard an unidentified flying object, and being subjected to a series of complex physical and psychological examinations and procedures. This particular incident is one of the very rare few that, unlike so many others, is in some way different. There is an indefinable sense of conviction, a feeling that something utterly unnerving and unearthly actually did happen on that night. This is the story of two ordinary men whom experienced an extraordinary event that would leave an indelible mark on the rest of their lives. Monday, August 17th, 1992, Edinburgh, Scotland, 10 p.m. Two local men, 33-year-old ambulance technician Gary Wood and his friend, 25-year-old Colin Wright, were driving along the A70 route near the Harperigg Reservoir, travelling between Edinburgh and Tarbrax, a small village in South Lanarkshire. This is a straightforward journey of which can be traversed in just 30 minutes, give or take traffic and weather conditions. At the time, Gary was reportedly driving at 40 miles an hour, in clear conditions and little traffic in the vicinity. On this night in particular, the pair intended on visiting the village in order to drop off a satellite system to one of their close friends. Whilst driving along the undulating country A70 road, something completely unexplainable took the two men by surprise. "What the hell is that?" exclaimed Colin, as he gazed up towards the starlit sky. Wright had spotted what appeared to be a black, shiny, disc-shaped object suspended in the air, roughly 20 feet above the road ahead of them. Gary described that, quote, "The craft had no lights, just a jet-black silhouette, was round on the underside, had 3 tiers and was approximately 30 feet in diameter," end quote. Gary and Colin continued to observe the object as they drew closer. Then, suddenly, Gary slammed his foot on the accelerator in an attempt to speed past the obscure object. Gary was driving like a bloody madman, according to Colin. What occurred next has been enshrined in the annals of UFO mythology. As they passed underneath the object, A bright beam of light emanated from the underside of the UFO that spanned almost the full length of the craft, completely blanketing the road in a shimmering curtain of light. At this point, Gary was now going too fast to have a chance of halting the car before being enveloped by the light. Upon entering the wall of light, the two men said they next experienced complete and utter darkness. Both witnesses couldn't see anything whatsoever, and Gary further noted that in that exact moment he could not see Colin in the passenger seat. Everything went blank. Gary would later go on to say, under hypnotic regression, that he recalled standing, presumably, outside the car in the total darkness. I thought I'd crashed the car and that I was dead. As suddenly as this event had unfolded, it was over. For what felt like a mere couple of seconds later, Gary and Colin were immediately thrust back into awareness and found themselves in the car, veering over to the right side of the road at a rate of knots. What was more perplexing, the two quickly realised that their car was facing the opposite direction, even though they had no recollection of turning the car around. Furthermore, their seatbelts were unfastened, and they were shaking uncontrollably. The mysterious object was nowhere in sight, and the brisk night air was a relief to the perturbed duo. Once they gathered themselves together, the two men resumed the drive to their friend's house in Tarbrax, and along the way, questioning what they had just experienced. When they finally arrived, they expected it to be around 10:40 p.m, considering the usual time the journey would typically take. However, when they knocked on the door, nobody answered. Instead, the now surprised friend poked his head out of the upstairs window and asked them what on earth they were doing. It was 12:45 a.m. in the morning. Gary and Colin had lost over 2 hours. Entering the house in a state of agitation, the men attempted to describe what they had seen, even sketching the craft they had witnessed hovering above the deserted stretch of road. It was well into the small hours when Gary and Colin left for Gilmerton, on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Not surprisingly, they did not return via the same route, and neither man recalls much more about the journey. The following day, Gary felt utterly drained of energy. More than just the result of this late night, he felt extremely worn out. The following few days did not help matters. He was not sleeping at all well. He experienced vivid and disturbing dreams, and his sleeping pattern had changed for the worst. Eventually, consulting his doctor because of the severe headaches, he was advised to have an MRI scan, which proved negative. Fearing ridicule, neither Gary nor Colin reported this incident to the police or the media. They did, however, inform BUFORA, the British UFO Research Association. As a result of the event, Gary became engrossed in ufology in an attempt at understanding what he and Colin had experienced. Through his intuitive research, Gary began to notice similar patterns in other cases that he and his companion had experienced. Soon, he and Colin came into contact with a research group known as the Strange Phenomena Investigators, led by a paranormal researcher by the name of Malcolm Robinson. He recommended that the duo undergo hypnotic regression in order to retrieve the missing time and uncover what could have taken place during those eluding 2 hours. During the very first session, Gary burst into tears and was inconsolable. There was nothing specific, only vague images and impressions. However, the second session would prove much more revealing. Both men recalled sitting in the car, motionless, as small, humanoid beings, 3 to each side, opened both doors. Colin recalls Gary being placed on a type of stretcher, which was floating off the ground. Although he remembers none of this, Gary does recall creatures approaching the car, then a sudden searing pain in his abdomen, as though he were being electrocuted. Colin recalls walking up a ramp into the craft, which was lit by a dazzling white light. He remembers being in a circular corridor, being led by one of the beings. The room was utterly featureless, except for an unusual chair. It was curiously curved, almost organic in shape. He was stripped naked and placed unresisting in the chair and subject to some form of non-intrusive physical examination. He also remembers lying back on the chair, looking at the ceiling. It was corrugated, translucent, with a soft, diffuse light filtering through. During the regression, Colin mentioned that, quote, "Something's in my right eye. It's uncomfortable, really sore, like a red-hot poker in the centre of my eye," end quote. Colin was shaking his head from side to side, trying to get a visual of what was performing this procedure. His vision was impaired until the device was removed from his eye. "Just took it out of my eye. My eye's really, really burning. It's really watering, it's gushing. I felt like there was something clamped on it. There was something going into my eye." In later sessions, Colin recovers another part of his memory being naked in a transparent container made of a material rather like glass or perspex. Outside the container, you could clearly see other men and women, all in transparent containers like his, and blowing around outside the container was a mist rather like the fog created by dry ice for stage and film visual effects. He also saw a number of tall humanoid beings, one of which was standing framed in a doorway opposite him, and another 3 were approaching the container in which he was imprisoned. Abruptly, the transparent material of the container began to frost up as Colin nervously watched an angular device rise from the floor. It was long and thin, like a rod with a triangular head, and 2 glowing red lights were set into one of the sides. The entire machine began moving slowly up and down continuously, whilst an appendage connected to the centre of the stalk swung from left to right, giving Colin the impression the device might be scanning him. Like Colin, Gary too described being in a featureless circular room, lying on a flat table, unable to move, although he does not recall being physically restrained. He was aware of a black, lens-shaped device in the centre of the room. The device was twisting and turning, almost as if it was folding in on itself. It reminded Gary of Mobius strip. Although he had no idea of its function, he had heard it making a whooshing sound, as if the air was being displaced. Gary had the impression that the device was turning or stabilising itself. Near the tableside, a small column rose from the floor. Gary described it resembling a tin can. It continued to rise until it was about 3 feet off the floor. The device began to rotate slowly as part of the cylinder rose from the main body and extended towards him, until it was level with his eyes. The tip of the extension housed 2 red glowing lights. Gary then noticed a hole in the floor open up. Inside was a pool of viscous liquid which began to vibrate. From the liquid, a tall, incredibly thin, frail-looking being slowly, almost painfully emerged. Although bearing a marked similarity to the traditional grey alien, it appeared emaciated, like a skeleton covered in skin. He remembers that the skin over its ribs looked discoloured and bruised. The reason for this appearance was later explained to him by another tall grey. The ETs had difficulty with the gravity and atmospheric pressure in our dimension, particularly the tall, thin humanoids that frequently tended to fall over. It was Gary's impression that due to the bruised appearance of the creatures, the pool of gel was some form of therapeutic agent, designed to treat the damage caused by the frequent falls. Gary communicated with another being that, as he described it, had a more heart-shaped face, with tribal-like markings adorned its cheeks. This one seemed more receptive, and so Gary asked mentally, "Why are you doing this?" Its reply was simple, if not slightly unnerving. "Sanctuary." Whilst in telepathic communication with the being, he was able to see fragments of its existence, to which the being found amusing, but could not prevent the process. The being continued, In many ways, you are more advanced than us, but you have been capped. Our existence is much like your own. We also have concerns and needs. Perhaps Gary's most worrying memory was seeing a young woman seated naked on the floor, facing the wall. One of the tall beings was standing beside her. As Gary looked at her, she turned her head towards him. Her hair was in a loose, shaggy perm with blonde highlights. She was sitting, shivering, with her knees drawn up to her chin. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, cradling herself. She had been crying, and was clearly in the same predicament as he. Following this, the two men were a little roughly reclothed, and then returned back to their vehicle, each being placed back in the original seating positions, the doors closed, and the beings returning to their craft, and silently rising up into the starlit night, and vanishing. From here, Gary and Colin returned to the state of consciousness they were initially left in, before the regression, driving down the road in the wrong direction, with no UFO in sight. A period of almost 6 months elapsed between the incident and the regressions. 6 months in which both men, because they were not conversant with the subjects of UFOs and ufology, read all they could about the subject and the mythology surrounding it, particularly Gary. This alone must render the disclosures as presented under regression unreliable. Add to this the predisposition for the typical hypnotic subject to please the questioner by saying what is expected of them in the evidence begins to fall apart. Without these crucial statements, what is left is the undeniable conviction of both men that a real event took place, an event that they cannot rationally explain. At the time, no serious attempt was made to present the events in terms other than an extraterrestrial encounter. There are other equally valid explanations for what did or did not occur, and none of them directly employed the extraterrestrial hypothesis theory. On Thursday, 12th of July 2012, newly declassified secret government X-Files reveal that a 2-page report on what became known as the A70 Incident was sent to the Ministry of Defence's UFO desk in 1996, a full 4 years after the mysterious encounter. The document, headlined Unexplained Aerial Sighting, is based on evidence provided by Mr. Wood, as well as further evidence to suggest that the UFO was picked up and tracked on radar. The Ministry of Defence took the matter of the alleged abduction of the two Scots very seriously. Other Scottish UFO sightings are revealed in the documents, many of which are reported by highly trained professionals, including Air Force pilots, commercial aviation pilots, and other military officials. Still to this day, those claiming to have had these experiences, of which most are traumatic, terrifying and invasive, are still being met with similar treatment by even those they believed they could confide in. Their families, close friends, and a high percentage of the authorities are, in the vast majority of cases, quick to be dismissive of these kinds of reports. The A70 abduction remains to this day one of the most bizarre and disturbing unsolved cases for over 25 years. I urge you, if you know someone who may have experienced this phenomenon, be sure to let them know they are not alone in dealing with their struggle. Thank you very much for watching this first episode. If you've made it this far down the rabbit hole, I hope to see you again next week. I've been your host, Agent D. Remember, always keep one eye on the sky.